Chapter 24. The Hiker's Lament. The first night they heard it, none of them wanted to be the one to say it aloud, because something about the sound seemed too human to be natural, too real to be dismissed, and yet too wrong to be confronted. It began as a low, trembling note just after midnight, as though someone far off was muttering through tears, their voice ragged with exhaustion and echoing across the slopes in a way that made direction meaningless. Avery had been the first to sit up in his sleeping bag, staring toward the thin mesh of the tent's window, though all he could see were the blurred shadows of pine trees swaying against the dark. He glanced toward Jules, who was still sleeping with his arm over his face, then to Cam, who stirred only slightly before settling again into the stillness of breath and blanket. At first, Avery thought it must be wind, a trick of acoustics, some unique way the air moved through the trees in this particular part of the wilderness. But then the sound changed, pitched upward slightly, broke into smaller sobs, and for the briefest moment it sounded like words were tangled in it. The next morning none of them spoke about it directly, at least not until coffee had been boiled and packs had been unzipped and rearranged, and sunlight had sufficiently warmed the edges of the clearing. Jules brought it up first, sitting cross-legged by the cold remains of the fire, poking the ash with a stick and watching the embers collapse. He didn't ask what they had heard, only if they had heard it. When Avery nodded, slow and unsure, Cam merely frowned and said it was probably a fox. "They scream," he reminded them. "They sound like someone being murdered." But none of them had ever heard a fox sob in steady, trembling rhythm for 20 minutes straight, stopping only when the dawn began to color the edge of the sky. They had been hiking for 3 days by then, on a narrow, unmarked trail that Avery had read about online, one of those whispered location kind of routes that didn't appear on official maps, but was cataloged through stories, photos, and half-remembered coordinates passed around in forums by backpackers and amateur cartographers. The trail wound up through a forgotten valley in the upper Rockies, far from the nearest ranger station, a corridor of untouched wilderness that promised solitude, challenging terrain, and the kind of peace that could only be found after miles of silence. Avery had picked it for the distance, for the altitude, and, though he hadn't admitted this to anyone else, for the legends. Not the kind of legends with monsters or portals or ancient ruins, nothing so elaborate or cinematic. The stories he'd read were simpler, always told in the margins, buried in the comments. Strange things at night, shadows that moved when they shouldn't, a voice that sometimes wept beyond the trees. Some hikers said it was wind or water, others blamed altitude sickness or exhaustion, and a few simply posted photographs that were intentionally out of focus, showing indistinct shapes between the trees, as though even the idea of clarity might offend the thing they were trying to depict. They hiked another 10 miles that day, pushing up a steep ridge that curved like a broken spine through the forest, and by mid-afternoon they found a ledge of high ground that overlooked the bowl of the valley below. It was beautiful in a way that made Avery feel guilty for his unease, the kind of view that seemed to suspend time, the dense evergreen canopy stretching outward in soft, dark waves beneath the sky so clear it felt more like ocean than air. Jules dropped his pack near a flat patch of grass and declared it home for the night. Cam, ever the practical one, set about finding a water source, while Avery wandered to the edge of the ridge and looked out across the valley, eyes tracing the place where the tree line met the river far below. He thought again of the sound, of how strangely sad it had been. Not like an animal, not like a trick of the wind, more like a person who had been crying for so long that they no longer remembered how to stop. That night they built a larger fire, partly for warmth, partly for light, and partly because no one wanted to say that they were afraid of the dark. Conversation drifted, turned to old stories and memories, then to silence. When the fire burned down to a low red glow, they crawled into the tent, zipped the flaps tight, and settled beneath layers of synthetic insulation and shared fatigue. For a while, the only sound was the steady whisper of wind moving through the trees. Then, just before 1, it started again.
It began softer this time, as though it had always been there and only now grew loud enough to hear. Avery sat up first, already wide-eyed, heart galloping beneath his ribs. The sobbing was closer now, not just louder, but nearer, as if the source had moved from one side of the ridge to the other and now hovered just beyond their camp. It was still wordless, still fractured and shuddering, but there was rhythm in it, the kind of rhythm that suggested breath, lungs, a body curled into grief. Cam sat up too, no longer dismissive. Jules was already fumbling for the zipper, peering out into the darkness with narrowed eyes. "Someone's out there," he muttered, more to himself than the others. "We should check." Avery caught his arm before he could move. "No, wait, just listen." So they sat there, all 3 of them, huddled in the tent with breath held and ears straining. The sobbing continued for a long time, sometimes rising to a quiet wail, sometimes fading almost completely. And though no footsteps came and no other movement could be seen, there was the overwhelming sense of a presence, a figure just out of reach, pacing slowly around the perimeter of the camp, never closer, never retreating. By the time it stopped, the fire was long dead, and the sky had begun to brighten at the edges with the first signs of morning. None of them slept. They didn't hike the next day. Cam suggested they stay put, rest, reassess. Jules agreed with a tired nod, and even Avery, who was usually the one pushing to move farther, to go deeper into the wilderness, found himself strangely reluctant to descend the other side of the ridge. He wandered the tree line for a while, examining the underbrush, searching for prints or disturbed branches, but found nothing. Whatever had cried last night had left no mark, no bent grass, no blood, no trail. But when he returned to camp, something new had appeared. Just a few feet from the cold fire pit, set carefully atop a stone, lay a strip of cloth, faded orange, frayed at the ends. Avery bent down and picked it up, turning it over in his hand. There was no tag, no logo, but the material was familiar, almost laughably so. It looked exactly like the bandana Jules always tied around his wrist when they hiked. He turned to show the others, only to find Jules staring at him already, pale and motionless. Slowly, Jules raised his hand and looked down at his bare wrist. "I didn't take it off," he said. Cam stepped back. "Are you messing with us?" "No," Jules said, his voice cracking. "I swear I didn't touch it." That night, they didn't build a fire. They stayed in the tent with the flap zipped tight and their packs pressed up against the opening, as though nylon and gear could offer protection from whatever moved beyond the trees. The sobbing came again, louder, closer. This time, it was not alone. There were voices beneath the weeping, voices that spoke in low, indistinct tones, overlapping and rising like breath through cracked lips. They didn't speak words, not exactly, but there was rhythm, cadence, the unmistakable shape of human speech. Cam held the hatchet in his hands, arms shaking, while Jules whispered prayers beneath his breath, prayers in a language Avery didn't know he spoke. Then, without warning, a hand pressed against the tent wall. It was unmistakable, 5 long fingers pushing into the nylon, leaving a deep indentation that slid slowly down the side of the fabric, as though whoever or whatever was out there was dragging their palm across it. Jules screamed. The hand vanished. The sobbing stopped. When morning came, Cam was gone. There was no sign of a struggle, no sign of departure. His boots were still inside the tent, his gear untouched, but he was simply not there, as if he had stepped out of existence entirely. And where he had slept, carefully placed on his sleeping bag, was another strip of cloth, this one dark green. Avery didn't say anything. Neither did Jules, because this time they understood what it meant. They hiked out in silence. Or at least, they tried to. But the trail, once so well marked by memory and the slow accumulation of footprints and intuition, no longer looked familiar. The ridge behind them grew more distant no matter which way they walked. The trees became thicker, darker. The sky overhead dimmed, as though the sun had grown weary of shining on a place that refused to obey the rules of the world. And that night, when they finally collapsed beside a narrow creek and tried to convince themselves they had made progress, the sobbing returned. But this time, it was different. This time, it sounded like Cam. Avery had never considered himself someone prone to fear. He had grown up on wilderness trails, taught to identify the difference between real danger and imagined threats, between the cracking of a branch beneath the weight of a deer and the irrational conviction that something was watching you from the darkness. But as he sat by the edge of the creek that night, listening to the soft, shuddering sobs that rose and fell with unnatural rhythm, he felt the kind of dread that existed beyond instinct, something old, marrow-deep, a knowledge that did not need to be learned but rather recognized, like a smell remembered from childhood or a face seen in a dream. The sobbing was unmistakably Cam's, not just the voice, but the breathing, the half-swallowed way he sometimes wept when he thought no one could hear him, the subtle shift in pitch when he was holding back something larger. It didn't rise to a wail or descend into madness. It simply persisted, quiet and constant, a kind of private grief made public in the most grotesque way imaginable. Avery didn't speak. He didn't look at Jules. He simply stared into the shadows across the creek, watching the thick blackness beneath the trees, waiting for the sound to end. But it didn't end. Jules shifted beside him, pulling his sleeping bag closer to his chest as if weight and fabric could defend him against what they now both understood. No animal could mimic Cam's voice so precisely. No echo could cry with such measured heartbreak. It wasn't just an imitation. It was Cam, or at least something that had taken him, worn his voice, and now wept with it like a stolen suit. By the time the sun rose, faint and colorless above a pale sky, the sound had finally stopped, but the impression of it lingered like smoke. Jules barely moved as Avery packed their remaining gear, his eyes sunken and expression distant, as though something had crawled inside his head during the night and drawn the curtains behind his gaze. They set off again without direction, guided only by a desperate sense of escape, though neither man believed there was still a path out of the forest. The woods had changed, not in appearance, though the trees seemed taller and the branches lower and the underbrush thicker with each mile, but in presence. The forest no longer felt indifferent, no longer part of the natural order of living things. It had begun to watch them, or at least that was the impression that built slowly over the course of the day. At first it was only a sound, the barely audible shift of leaves even when the air was still, or the quiet crunch of footfalls that didn't match their own pace. Then it became the sensation of passing through something unseen, as though invisible cobwebs brushed their faces or unseen fingers drifted across the backs of their necks. Avery tried to ignore it. He focused on keeping moving, on scanning for landmarks, on counting the hours by the position of the sun when he could glimpse it through the trees. But Jules slowed more with every step, his breaths growing short, his hands trembling. Once, in a moment that neither of them could later explain, they stumbled upon the same creek they had camped beside the night before. It should have been behind them, miles back, yet here it was, unchanged. Avery dropped his pack and stared down at the exact stone where he had first crouched to filter water. Jules sat on a nearby log, staring at the ground. "We aren't getting out, are we?" Avery said nothing. That night, they didn't light a fire. They didn't pitch the tent. They didn't sleep.
They sat against the trees, with their backs to the bark and their knives in their hands, listening. The forest breathed around them, slow and deep and uneven, like a sleeping thing that had begun to stir. And when the sobbing began again, it was not only Cam's voice they heard. There were others. Layered beneath his cries came a second voice, and a third, then more, too many to count, too many to comprehend, all of them crying softly, mournfully, broken and aimless, their breaths rising together like a choir of the forgotten. It was not a noise born of rage or pain, but of sorrow so deep it had outlived the people who felt it.
Jules whispered something. Avery leaned closer. "What did you say?" "I can see them," Jules murmured. "Over there." Avery turned. For a long moment there was nothing but trees. Then, slowly, figures began to emerge. They were not solid in the way people were, not rooted in the same physics, but neither were they transparent or vague. They appeared like impressions burned into film, faded outlines filled with something thicker than shadow, moving with a fluidity that betrayed thought and emotion, not randomness. The nearest one looked like a woman, tall and thin, her face obscured by tangled hair, her shoulders hunched in grief. Another crouched near a tree, hands pressed to its trunk as though it were a gravestone. Avery rose slowly, unable to stop himself, walking toward the edge of their camp with deliberate steps. As he drew closer, the figures came into sharper relief. There were dozens of them scattered through the trees, all weeping. Some knelt, some stood, some sat with their backs to the forest, all caught in some endless act of mourning. He turned back to Jules. "They're not ghosts." Jules didn't respond. "They're people," Avery continued, his voice cracking. "They're us, campers, hikers, lost people." He looked again, and recognition struck him like a hammer. One of them had Cam's face. Another, near the edge of the clearing, looked almost exactly like Jules, only thinner, more haggard, and weeping silently with his face buried in his hands. Avery stepped back. "No," he said aloud. "No, this isn't real." The figures did not react. They simply continued their lament, a ritual too deep to break, their voices rising in waves of sorrow and fading again into low, steady hums. Jules stood slowly, his face slack, his eyes distant. "I think I understand now," he said. "What do you understand?" asked Avery. "They're not mourning themselves," Jules said. "They're mourning us." The implication hit Avery all at once. The sobbing had always come before Cam vanished, before the cloth appeared, before they saw the others. What if the sobbing doesn't follow the lost? What if it marks them? As soon as the words were spoken, the silence was absolute. Not quiet, not still, but hollow, like something massive had inhaled and was waiting to exhale. And in that silence, Jules looked at Avery, eyes wide with realization. "I heard my own voice last night, mixed with the others." "No," asked Avery. "Don't!" Jules stepped forward. He didn't run, he didn't cry out, he simply walked, barefoot and slow, toward the figures in the trees, and they moved to meet him. They didn't drag him, didn't pull him away, they simply opened space between them, and he stepped into it like a man returning home. Avery tried to follow, but the moment Jules disappeared between the trees, the forest closed behind him. The path vanished. The figures faded. The sobbing resumed. Only this time, it was louder, and one of the voices sounded exactly like him. He fell to his knees, trembling. His hands gripped soil and pine needles, and his thoughts scattered like leaves in wind. He didn't know how long he stayed there. By the time he stood again, the sun had risen fully. He began to walk, not toward destination, but away from the noise. Except it followed, and every time he stopped, it grew closer. He passed the creek again, though it shouldn't have been there. He passed the same patch of grass, the same fallen log, the same crooked tree where they had first heard the crying. The world was a loop, and in its center, a mourning song waited. He didn't know what it meant to be marked, or why the voices cried before they claimed. But as he stepped once more into a clearing that should not have existed, and saw his own sleeping bag laid out beneath the trees, untouched, undisturbed, he understood one thing. He was next. For the rest of that day, Avery walked without rest, without food, and without direction, circling through a landscape that had begun to warp and turn in on itself like a closed fist. The forest no longer followed the rules of time or space, and though he told himself that forward was better than stillness, some part of him had accepted that movement itself was meaningless here. He passed the same moss-covered boulder 3 times, recognized a half-burned tree stump he had seen before, and each time he tried to alter his path, turning hard to the east or descending into ravines in search of lower ground, he found himself returning again to the center of the spiral. The clearing, the creek, the log where Jules had sat just before he'd seen his own ghost weeping in the trees. It was evening when Avery's body began to slow against his will. His legs ached with a heat that spread up into his back, and his lungs tightened as if the air had grown heavier. He leaned against a tree and tried to catch his breath, but even the act of stillness offered no peace, only the awful pressure of knowledge building inside his head, the certainty that the rules had changed and there was no rescue, no radio signal, no accidental discovery by a ranger or a hunter or a storm chaser with a drone. He was not lost in the traditional sense. He had been taken, moved onto a path that went nowhere, carried through a space that was not wilderness anymore, not fully real and not yet imaginary. The sobbing returned before dusk had fully fallen. It began low, like breath trembling through a narrow throat, and as always, it carried the timbre of someone who had once lived, someone he knew. Not just Cam now, not only Jules, but others too, voices he had not heard in years. He heard his father first, or what he remembered of his father's voice. Then he heard Elena, a girl he had dated briefly in college, who had died in a skiing accident the winter after they broke up. Then his sister. Her voice was younger than he remembered, caught in the version of her that had died of meningitis when they were children. Then, most terribly, he heard his own voice join the others. It came softly at first, and the recognition was not immediate. He thought it was a trick, a mimicry, some fragment echoed through the weeping of others, but the cadence was perfect. The pauses, the swallow between breaths, the precise way his throat tensed when trying not to cry. Avery collapsed to his knees. He did not weep, though his body wanted to. He did not scream, though the horror of recognition was enough to split his mind down the middle. Instead, he turned his head slowly, forcing himself to look into the forest, to look for the thing that had always waited just beyond the light of the circle. And there it was. Not one figure now, not a scattered few. Hundreds. They stood among the trees in dense, unbroken formation, their outlines sharper now, their forms more defined. Each was hunched or kneeling or clutching their heads or holding folded hands across their chests as though locked in eternal prayer. And in the center of them all, perhaps only 20 feet from where he knelt, stood a version of himself, his back turned, body thin, posture slack with grief. Avery rose. He walked toward it. The copy did not move. He stood behind it, studying the details. The clothes were identical to the ones he now wore. The same shoes, the same backpack, torn slightly at the seam near the shoulder strap, the same mole on the back of the neck. It was him. "Why are you crying?" he asked it. The copy trembled but did not answer. "Why are you mourning me?" Still no reply. Avery reached out and placed a hand on its shoulder. The figure collapsed like wet paper, falling in on itself and crumpling into ash. It dissolved in the breeze, vanishing entirely. And for a moment the sobbing stopped. But then, without warning, it resumed, twice as loud. Behind him, all the other figures began to wail, their voices rising in a single wave of sound that struck the trees and bent the grass, a windless force of sorrow that shook the forest itself. Avery stumbled back, covering his ears, teeth clenched, eyes shut tight. He didn't open them again until the noise ceased. When he did, he was no longer in the forest. He stood in a vast field of black soil beneath a blank sky. There was no sun, no stars, only a flat grayish light that seemed to come from nowhere. The horizon was distant and undefined, as though the world itself had been drawn with charcoal and left smudged by a careless hand. The ground beneath his feet cracked with each step, dry and hollow, and there was no sign of life anywhere, except for the monument. It stood alone in the center of the field, a massive stone obelisk wrapped in chains, its surface carved with names, hundreds, thousands, perhaps millions, each etched with precise cuts that shimmered faintly when he moved. As he drew closer, Avery saw dates beside them. Years, some recent, some ancient. And then he saw his own name, Avery Hale. The date was tomorrow. He reached out and touched it. Instantly his vision split. In one half he saw himself lying in the dirt, his body collapsed at the base of a tree, skin pale, mouth open in a silent cry. Crows circled overhead. The wind moved gently through the trees. In the other half, he stood among the mourners, not dead, not alive, caught in the space between, a figure locked in place, voice raised not in terror or anger, but in a grief too vast for language. He staggered back. The obelisk began to tremble. From beneath the earth came a groaning sound, deep and resonant, like a stone gate opening beneath miles of soil. The chains on the monument shivered. Names began to fade from the surface. New names appeared. Avery turned and ran. He did not know where he was going. He did not know if the field had edges. But he ran. And as he did, the world around him cracked and fell away. The field became forest again, bleeding in at the edges. Trees grew out of the soil in impossible speed. The sky split open and became night. The stars returned, blinking overhead. He fell to his knees once more in the familiar clearing. The fire pit lay before him, still cold. His pack was beside it. The tent had returned. For a moment, everything was exactly as it had been before. Then, from the tree line, Cam stepped out. His eyes were glassy, but his body was intact. Behind him came Jules. Then, others.
More hikers, campers, park rangers, men and women, old and young, all of them quiet, expressionless. They formed a circle around Avery. He stood slowly. "Why me?" he asked. Cam tilted his head. "You stayed." Jules nodded. "You looked back." Another voice spoke, a child's voice. "You heard your own cry." Avery turned to the center of the circle. There stood the version of himself again, no longer crying, but smiling faintly, eyes calm. "You broke the loop," the copy said. "You left grief. You passed through it." Avery blinked. "So I'm free?" The copy stepped forward. "No, you're chosen." The figures raised their hands. The forest dimmed. Avery's body locked in place. He could no longer move, but he was not afraid. The air around him thickened, and with it came knowledge. Not speech, not thought, but memory. The voices were not curses, they were warnings. The mourners were not ghosts, they were guides. Every hiker who had disappeared, every camper who had vanished, had not died in the traditional sense. They had become part of the forest's memory, emissaries of grief, guardians of the place where reality thinned and sorrow took shape. They marked others not to doom them, but to prepare them, to bring them here, to continue the lament. And Avery, having heard his own cry, having walked through the spiral and returned, was no longer a visitor. He was a keeper. The forest would now weep through his voice, and someday, when the next hiker stepped too far off the trail, too deep into the old woods, they would hear Avery's sobs through the trees, soft, sad, steady. And they would not understand. Not yet, but they would.
Thank you for listening to this story. Your support means a lot and helps keep these tales coming. If you enjoyed it, please take a moment to subscribe and follow for more dark and immersive stories just like this one. New horrors await. Don't miss what's coming next.